Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. So today's topic was requested by one of my subscribers and I hope you like it. So the topic is NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, and it's actually a really meaty topic. There's a lot to cover in it. So today will just be part one. I'm going to give you a bit of background information, just a bit of an overview, who started it, what it is, and also under what conditions it can be applied and things like that. So again, this is quite an in-depth topic. I mean, people specialize in this, so there's a lot that can be said about it, but let's just ease into it and start with this for now. So I'm going to be sharing with you my screen. It's a PowerPoint presentation. Yes, PowerPoint. I'll be damned if I don't use those skills that I learned at school. Didn't pay all that money for nothing. Anyways, so I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find it useful. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I did put my channel email on my About page. So if you want to write me and ask me something, or you can ask in the discussion part of the channel or just in the comments, whatever works. Just don't feel shy to get in touch. And if you have any questions, if you have any further suggestions for another topic, I will be making a couple more of these videos just on NLP because it is quite in depth. So let's go ahead and get started. I will share my screen with you, and like I said, follow along, and if you did want a copy of it, then get in touch with me and I can send you the PowerPoint or a PDF version, whatever works for you. All right, let's get started. So as I said, NLP stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. So what does that mean? So it's really well represented here nice and easily through this Venn diagram. I love my Venn diagrams, they're just great. So neuro, it's about the brain component. So the way you think, the way you process information, events, stimuli, data, whatever you want to call it, how you actually understand and categorize what's happening around you, the senses, your taste, smell, touch, sight, hearing, all of the auditory, sorry, be more precise. So the way that you actually comprehend those things and how you assign meaning to those things. That is the neuro part. The linguistic part is the words themselves, the way you choose to describe it. There's a very famous study, and it's basically two cars have an accident or a collision. See, that already implies accident implies no fault. A collision implies the action, what happened, two cars collided. So they would say something like, what did you notice when the two cars hit each other, when they smashed into each other, when they crashed, whatever, right? So the words themselves have their own meaning and connotations, and they will influence how you interpret the information, how you choose to feel about something, what kind of schemas, or as they say in NLP, maps that you access, and how you categorize everything. So these two things are very much intertwined because you can't think without words. I mean, you can think in pictures as well, but that in and of itself, you describe a certain kind of narrative or a motif in your head. So then the programming, that is when you've taken in the N and the L part, it translates into the P part, the programming. It's your behavior, your output. The first two are inputs, and then you're moving into the output section. So how you actually have organized your ideas, how you have interpreted everything, how you've assigned meaning or value judgments to certain actions. Then you will have a reaction. This is the way that you are affected by everything. And so everyone will have their own interpretations of things. This is how everyone is so different. You may even be twins, and they've shown this in twin studies. Two people, same sex, same age, literally born one after the other, same home environment, they look even the same genetics, and yet they experience the world differently. One will become a smoker, one will become obese, whatever. This happens, even twins separated at birth. So in any case, this is exactly how, when you ever ask yourself, are you seeing what I'm seeing? When people watch the elections, or when people are in an argument, or whatever the case may be, someone likes it, someone doesn't like it, one thinks it's oppression, another thinks it's liberation. So this is actually a very good method of training yourself, because this is something that you do instinctively, but it's something, if you are aware of these processes, you can actually modify and have it work to your benefit. So, now who started NLP? Actually, it's not any single person because it's been inspired by other disciplines within psychology. So, basically, it's taken from 3 different fields, but the person, well, 2 people who started it were John Grinder, and he was a linguist, and they called him the master of persuasion, and Richard Bandler, who was his assistant, and he was also a mathematician and a programmer, and his specialty was formulas. So this whole process is based on modeling, making models of behavior, cognitions, emotions, all of the aspects that go into human activity. So basically, as I said, it's a model system. So it's formulaic. Its goal is to predict behavior and reactions and beliefs and attitudes, and to then modify those beliefs, behaviors in all types of settings. So these 2 have actually written a couple of books, somewhat obscure books about communication and persuasion and things like that, which I'll get into in the next slide. But there's another chap, Alfred, I'm going to butcher this name, Korzybski, and in 1933, and he wrote, and this is actually kind of an old science-ish, relatively, and he wrote in his book Science and Sanity, he said that almost all psychological problems were the result of an inability for a person to traverse logical levels. So what does that mean? People have a hard time reasoning and figuring things out logically, and so they end up relying on maladaptive strategies that don't work for them. And so that's where psychological problems come in, is ultimately it's poor thinking procedures and poor reactions to those events and emotions. So, as you can see, these books are still available on Amazon, so if you are interested, go ahead and pick them up. They're both linked in this presentation, but I can also put the links for you in the description below as well. If you can find them elsewhere, go for it. If you're interested in more of the kind of, the dark and nefarious applications of NLP, there is a book actually called Dark NLP, so have a look at that if you're interested as well. Now, as I mentioned before, that NLP was inspired by 3 different disciplines. Those 3 different disciplines were Gestalt Therapy, family therapy, and hypnosis. Now, for those of you who may not know, and I can do a whole other topic about this in and of itself, but in a nutshell, Gestalt therapy is a sort of existential, experimental form of psychotherapy. And the point of it is to put more emphasis on personal responsibility and focus on the client or individual's personal experiences in the present moment, and to form a good kind of client-therapist relationship so that you can more deeply dive into the client's life in all environmental and social contexts of that client's life, so that you can really have a good understanding of who they are in a holistic, well-rounded sense. And then that way you are better able to help them self-regulate and make adjustments, that will help them in a therapeutic application, and just to try to see the person as in an overall sense and not fragmented by just this particular incident or that incident. Because it's, for example, if someone says, well, I'm stressed out at work, well, you could try to help them in that environment alone, but you have to ask them, are you always stressed out? Like, what kind of person are you? How do you typically deal with stress? Is it work stress that's a problem, or all stress that's a problem? So you want to understand them in a holistic sense, but you also want to understand that the person has to learn to take responsibility, and that you are not the crutch for the client. So anyways, I won't get too sidetracked by that, but the person who Grinder and Bandler were very inspired by was Fitz Pearls. And basically, he had the idea that maturity compared to immaturity was the ability for a person to manage their frustrated desires alone without the help of someone else. So, great example is the difference between a child and an adult. A child has a problem, they have frustrated desires, they can't manage them on their own. That's why they cry to their mommies and daddies. That's why they cry to their teacher. That's why they need other people to help them. Even teenagers, they always rely on friends. But the sign of a mature adult, according to Pearls, is that you're able to manage these problems on your own. Yes, of course, you may seek advice and counsel, but the point is that you're in control of yourself and you can do these things on your own, and that is what a mature adult does. So he has this kind of 3-point theory. You have to, when you're in this situation, these frustrated desires, one is that you don't get your way, your own way. What you wanted didn't happen. So you have to now act against your will. You wanted this thing, it's not going to happen for you, but you have to deny yourself, act against your own will, and you have to, hopefully that event will turn out okay. Now, it doesn't always turn out okay. Sometimes people can do 1 and 2. They can deny themselves, they can act against their will, but when it doesn't turn out okay, that is upsetting for them and distressing. But again, maturity is the ability to manage that distress, even when things don't go your way. So the goal is for that, even when things don't turn out okay, for it to be okay for you anyway. So this is something that control freaks have a problem with. Their behaviors manifest through a lack of trust. They try to control everything and manage everything because they feel they can't trust things to work out on their own. We may have traits of this, we may have quite a serious problem with this, but it's a fairly common human behavior and emotion. Now, from the family therapy aspect, this was Virginia Satir, I believe it's pronounced. Now, her whole motto was healing the world through family therapy, through using communication and to change people's behavior through certain techniques. People actually called her a magician of sorts because she, by some, we don't know how, was able to almost instantaneously fix people's problems. They would come in and leave fine. One wonders what happened there. And of course, by Milton Erickson, and he was a psychotherapist and a medical hypnotist. He was actually able to convince the APA that hypnosis was, in fact, a scientific tool for psychoanalysis. And he used the unconscious mind as a tool itself for generating solutions. You might have heard the iceberg theory. What's on the top is the conscious level of understanding, and everything like 80-90% is below. It's unconscious, it's subconscious. We do things, and only after can we realize why we did them. People think that they're able to rationalize and then act. Oftentimes we act and then rationalize. So that's very important to keep in mind. So again, hypnosis is a whole other topic, really interesting topic. But just for now, keep in mind that is these 3 things put together that spawned, if you will, NLP. So let's talk a little bit about who Grinder himself was, because he has a somewhat interesting background. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are aware that psychological warfare and other psychological tools are used on the general population, and they can be used for good or not good. So it's not fair to say that the tool itself is bad. It's how you use it, right? A knife itself is not bad. It's bad if you stab someone with it, right? It can be used to prepare food and it can be used to kill. So you have to properly place value or not place value on certain tools. Like when we think of psychology, everyone assumes that you're trying to dig into someone's head and manipulate them, and that's not necessarily true. People who are practitioners of psychology, be it NLP or CBT or MI or whatever, they have to have the best intentions of the client. So just a caveat, not all therapists are evil, and not all psychological techniques are meant for abuse. It's just how they're used. Right. So, who was Grinder? Now, as you may not be surprised at all by this, he, of course, used to work for the CIA. Now, we all know that the CIA has used psychological techniques to learn how to control people. It's where we get MK Ultra from, which is real. It's been declassified. If you're interested, go and look it up. It's real. It was on mainstream news. Nobody is hiding it anymore, and yet people don't believe. Why? Because they've been trained not to believe. So even in the face of truth, people will still hold to the narrative. And that is definitely one way to use NLP. And we'll be discussing that a little bit further on. So he worked for the CIA. What did he do? Well, he and Anthony Robbins, as commonly known as Tony Robbins, you must have heard of him before. He does all that motivational speaking and all the rest of it. He uses NLP as well. So he and Bandler were hired by the CIA to increase the pass rate of sharpshooters. Now, the original pass rate used to be 20%, but they came in, they did some models, and they said, look, give us your best 5 sharpshooters. And they modeled their traits, what they think about, what they're visualizing, how they hold their weapon, how they breathe, everything about them. And they modeled their best, performances, and were able to apply it and train the rest of the team. And then they had a pass rate from 20% up to 80%. Now that is an incredible outcome. I think most people would agree. So you can see that NLP is very effective. And it works in virtually any setting. So again, this is a formulaic model. It's based on 1, the model and formula itself, and 2, the experimentation, the application, the trial and error to actually see which models work better than others and then to apply them. So the whole point is to predict and alter neurological responses to language combined with the sensory input to retrain and reinterpret the events. So whereas some people might have a negative experience with something, you will retrain them to have a neutral or positive experience to that same event or stimuli. Ultimately, the goal is to produce excellence in any field. Now, if you have considered excellence in another setting, for example, a philosophical setting, Aristotle also talks about excellence, and he calls it eudaemonia. Now, what is eudaemonia? I've put also a link to that as well if you'd like to read about it on your own, but I'll just quickly summarize it for you. Eudaemonia as well is excellence in the sense of being good at something and it making you happy being good at that thing, just in a very quick and dirty sort of way. So where have we heard that before? Well, we've also heard it in the Constitution, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That is a very Aristotelian notion of excellence. You want to be happy, but you also want the freedom to pursue a meaningful life, a life that you are good at. And that's why we think of American exceptionalism, because we practice those things. So it's actually a very good model because it's very innate for people. They have a natural instinct to want to achieve something and to be good at it and to be happy about it and to be proud of themselves to doing that. So again, these psychological tools, they're not necessarily for therapeutic applications. They're not necessarily for warfare. They're not necessarily for one thing or another. It's how they're used and what they're used for. Remember also that the special trait that Grinder had, why he worked for the CIA, is that he was very, very good at studying people. He would insert himself into a culture, assimilate to that culture, and then extract intelligence about that culture, about their behavior, and about all these traits about them, and then he would be able to model those behaviors and be able to predict that whatever would they wanted to predict out of it. So if you think about it, what he's doing is sort of what algorithms do. You collect data, you filter it through certain filters, and then you get a sort of output, a model of what you can expect from this user or from this group or whatever. Okay, so keep that in mind because that is one of the very powerful tools about NLP. So, in a nutshell, the goal of NLP, as I said, was excellence in any field. Now, how do you achieve that excellence in any field? Well, you have to do several things. One, you need to be able to manage your internal states and change your emotions at will. You're not going to be a go with the flow kind of person. You're not going to be a reactionary when you are proficient in NLP. You are going to be able to manage the input, reorganize it in such a way that you decide the response, the reaction you're going to have. You can change your mental states and emotional states at will. You are not at the whims of your emotions, but you are in charge of your emotions. Another really beneficial tool or ability that NLP gives you is that you are very resourceful under stress. Oftentimes people panic and they kind of break down and crumble. If you are properly trained and able to manage yourself, you will be very resourceful under stress, and that is especially why the governments are interested in this, because we talk about super soldiers and things like that, but just regular soldiers need to be able to do this, and any resilient person would be hopefully interested in learning how to manage themselves, their emotions, and their stress. So another thing, of course, that results out of these two aforementioned characteristics is a very high degree of behavioral flexibility. And what does that mean? So when you're under pressure, you have a dynamic range of reactions. So in any difficult situation, as I said, whether it be in wartime, whether it be in a boardroom meeting, whether it be negotiating with your spouse or your children or whatever, hostage situation, whatever, you have many options available to you because you're in control of yourself. You're able to see which of the maps or schemas you want to use that are in your repertoire, and you're able to harness those skills in the moment quickly and react in the appropriate way. So you are very good at being a chameleon, I guess you could say. What else is if you're able to do all these things, then naturally the next point follows. You have an increased learning speed and you have better learning outcomes. If you're able to change as the situations change and react according to your own will and not just as a knee-jerk reaction, then you are a much better learner and you're able to actually have good outcomes from your learning. You'll learn quickly and you'll learn well. Now, this last point here, I think it's something we see in other people, and maybe we don't know how it is that they do it, but I think that one of the reasons they're able to be such good influencers is because they have the ability to control themselves and to control the environment and therefore to control other people. So you can become an influencer in any group using these techniques. So again, NLP is something that can be applied just through your internal dialogue. You can change your beliefs. You can change your psychological behaviors. You can change your physical behaviors. So all these models are designed to predict the desired outcome. For example, people often think that they are victims of their emotions, right? They have a panic attack or an anxiety attack, and they just think it's come over them and it's got them in its clutches. That's not true. NLP says that certain skills are required for you to have a certain experience. You can't just have a negative experience out of nowhere. You have to filter and process all the information that's coming in and assign it certain values in order for you to have that experience. So when, like for example, road rage, someone cuts you off, you've taken it as a slight, people are out to get you, no one knows how to drive, blah, blah, blah. Another person who is in control of their emotions will just think, oh, that person's in a rush, well, I better give them their space. So one person freaked out and the other person didn't. Why? Because you've interpreted it that way. And so the same skills that are required for you to have a positive experience, the exact same skills are required for you to have a negative experience. All of that is different is how you frame the situation. And the beliefs that you hold, again, part of your maps. And therefore, you can motivate a person to act in one way instead of another way, even when under stress, even when they're afraid, even whatever, when the situation may be ambiguous. So all these internal beliefs determine what kind of behaviors people engage in, if they're going to be risk takers, if they're not going to be risk takers, if they're going to be shy, if they're going to be outgoing. So you have to sort of construct your own reality. You can't interpret reality without having a set of filters, right? It's just really that simple. And therefore, oftentimes the things that we internalize are what we build our maps and schemas on. So if someone tells you, oh, you have a terrible singing voice, don't ever bother singing, you internalize that and you believe that that is true, and therefore you will not ever take the chance to sing. And you project back out that which you have internalized in. So you're kind of like a projector screen. There's a little film inside of you, and you're putting this onto the world. You're constructing your own reality, and it leads to action or inaction. It's all dependent on how you've perceived everything and what values you've assigned to it, and whether or not you will act in one way or another way. So as you can see just by this image alone, this was taken from Deloitte's, and as you know, Deloitte's is a consulting firm, and they do various things, but they use NLP because they want to see how they can influence and predict people's reactions, in this particular case, based on government issues and in certain domains, in certain fields. So if you just have a look here, they want to predict how you're going to react to something, improve your compliance to certain policies, enhance policy analysis, analyze public feedback. So they're always taking in information, and that's going to get translated into how you refilter, reinterpret everything, and how you're going to now act based on your opinions or newly formed opinions on the environment, on the financial sector, in defense and national security, on healthcare, conversely, possibly on education, on relationships, and so on and so forth, on family values. These are all strategies that are used by many, many different groups and by different individuals for all sorts of applications. So consider this. A public service announcement may be trying to use NLP to make you want to, as I said in a previous video, to maybe try to get you to quit smoking or to eat better or exercise more, or maybe to have better family values instead of not good family. Okay, those are all good applications for NLP, but the same thing can happen by making you think that it's completely fine to be a hedonistic person and indulge in whatever you want. Those types of things are not going to be so good for you in life, and therefore it's very important to try to step outside yourself a little bit and see what is the message, kind of like what journalists are supposed to do. Who is paying for this message? What is it trying to get me to do and think and believe? What will happen if I agree with it or don't agree with it? There's all these, follow the money, follow the agenda, all these things you should try to keep in mind to see how you're being engineered and for what goal. Because just as this can be used to control you, you can use it to control yourself and to resist the programming. So just keep that in mind. It's called neuro-linguistic programming. So if you don't want to be programmed, figure out what the program is and don't participate. Do not let it work on you, because if you know what the trick is, like a magician, if you know what the trick is, then you see it. And if you don't know what it is, then you will think that it's real. So just be aware and try whenever possible. Sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes you don't know that they're programming you. So just, again, be aware. Know that these are the types of tools that are used to sway public emotion or opinions, and it's very effective. So don't think that you're smarter than hundreds of years of wisdom, but just be aware of it and do your best to participate when you want to and withdraw your consent when you don't want to participate. Now, there are many different techniques that are used in NLP to elicit changes in beliefs, in behaviors, and the rest of it. So I'm just going to go through them just as a list, because there is many more than this, but I just want to, give you the basic understanding of it. If you'd like to look the rest of them up on your own, you can do, but this is something that I will discuss in the next presentation. So for example, some techniques are a visual swish or an auditory swish, conflict integration, the 6-step reframe, belief change process, the circle of excellence, behavioral reposturing, eye integration. This is actually very much about how you store imprints by where you're looking. Depends on if you're thinking about a linguistic application, if it's a visual. This is actually kind of a complicated one, and if you're interested in it, this is the one that I can cover. I can try to cover them all, but let's just pick a few, because again, this is like getting a whole degree. It's really quite a lot. So with this eye integration as well, there's emotional buttons. Now we can consider these like a trigger, right? We're familiar with this type of language. And another one, which is the EMDR, and this has a lot to do with trauma and how trauma is processed. Francine Shapiro, yes, Shapiro. So this is something that she and Robert Dilts worked on. And again, a lot to say, but just keep in mind that there are many different techniques. And the main takeaway point from this is that, again, the tools themselves are not good or bad. It's how they're applied. Some are therapeutic and some can be nefarious, right? So it's just techniques for how to train yourself, okay? So, and there's a great saying that goes with this, and it's used in NLP. Knowing without doing is not knowing. We all may know what to do, but if we don't do it, then we don't really know. And actually, it reminds me of a Bible verse. I believe it's Romans 8. It says, like, my body, that which my body wills, I can't do, but I know what it is that I'm supposed to do, but I can't do it. And this is ultimately what it's trying to say as well, is it's not enough to know something. You have to practice it, because then you really know that thing. Okay. Now, you may be interested to learn this, but researchers have studied this, and they say that out of a possible 2 million bits of data, sensory information that we're exposed to every day, the brain is able to filter out and process about 134,000 bits of that 2 million. Now, that's still quite an obscene amount. But here's the thing. Based on the filters you apply and what you're actually able to pay attention to, because attention is a very limited resource. You can only look at what you can look at. You can only smell and taste and hear and touch so many things at one time. Not only that, but without a focus, without a certain aim, you can't notice anything. It's very interesting. People are not necessarily aware of this, but what does the word sin actually mean? It doesn't mean doing bad things. It means missing the mark. It means there is an aim and you've missed it. There is a proper behavior to do and you've not done it. So that is what sin means. And in a similar way, attention is having something to look towards, to act towards. Now, moving on with attention, what goes with attention? Well, memory, right? Now, memory is a very interesting thing. Memory is not like a tape recorder that you record everything and you can just play it back. We add bits of information. We fill in the blanks, if you will. We omit and clip out information, whether we wanted to get rid of that and not think of it because it's unpleasant, or maybe you think it's irrelevant, or you just forget. Okay, so storage, recall, memory is a very interesting thing. So there is something called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, which means most people, some who have poor memory or exceptional savant-like memory will of course be the outliers, but most people can remember about 7 things plus or minus 2, so 5 to 9. Now we can do this test. I can say a digit span for you and have you repeat those numbers back, and you'll see that on average, some you'll do more, some you'll do less, but it's about 7 plus or minus 2. Why do you think people can just about remember a phone number? So, not anymore though, I guess, not with smartphones. But in any case, so memory and attention, it's all based on input and proper storage, and only then can you recall and react and have the output. There are other phenomena that have been studied as well, and they are things like change blindness. We don't notice when things change because we expect continuity. So I'm going to show you a little test. There's so many of these out there. There's the one of the people passing the basketball, and you're supposed to count how many times they pass the basketball, but nobody noticed that there's this giant gorilla beating its chest. And it's just so obvious once you see it, but people don't see it because they're not expecting to see it. So again, these filters are based on expectations, what seems logical. If you've been in this situation before or not, you think of basketball, you don't think of a gorilla, right? So novelty in a situation you may or may not notice. If it really stands out, you'll notice it, but if you're not, you won't know. Again, it's all based on the schemas and the cognitive map that you have constructed. So let's go ahead and watch this video and see what you can notice about it, if you notice any of it at all. Okay, so be honest with yourself and see what you can write down and notice, and at the end of the video it's going to tell you everything that has changed, so see if you can catch it. So how did you do? Did you catch most of it, some of it, none of it? I know that I didn't notice a lot of it, and I would consider myself to have pretty good memory and pretty good attention. So you just don't know what you don't know, right? And you don't know what to expect, and that's why it's really important to try to train yourself to be aware of these things. So here's another picture for you. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of it's like a children's book, but I would say it's difficult for adults too. Have you heard of Where's Waldo before? Ultimately, we live in a version of Where's Waldo. There's a flood of sensory information, absolutely overloaded with sensory information, and you just try to make the best of it, try to make sense of what you're seeing, and it's difficult. So have a little look at this picture, pause the video if you want to, and see if you can find Waldo, and see how long it takes you. I'm going to come back to the this scene at the end of the video, and I'm going to show you where he was. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And it took me a while to find him because I couldn't show you this picture without having the answer for you. So see if you can find it. Okay, good luck. Now here is another great illustration to show basically what's happening when you're thinking. How do you actually process information? So you start off with the external event, whatever stimuli information that goes in through the eyes and other sensory receptors. But let's just focus on the eyes for the sake of this explanation. Then you filter it. Now I'm going to be explaining these filters in the next slide, so just stick with me for the moment. Basically what happens is you have the input, you filter it through various things, the language, your past memories, your beliefs, your attitudes, meta programs, which I'll speak about in the next presentation because that's a whole other thing. And basically you internalize what's happening. You have your own representation of it. This is the maps, the cognitive schemas that I was talking about before. It gets them further filtered through the state that you're in. Are you in a good mood, bad mood? You know, that's why they say if you want to raise, ask your boss when they're in a good mood. And then your physiological state as well. Are you ill that day? Are you, because moods and physical things are different. You know, if you have a broken leg that day, it's going to affect your mood, but you can also have a bad mood without having a broken leg. So these are all just various states that we are in. All of this gets filtered, and as you can see, the arrows are intertwined and they go in bidirectional, you know, one can affect the other. And then finally you get the output, which is your behavior. So that's ultimately what we're doing, and this happens very quickly in milliseconds. Okay, so let's now move on to these three filters, and we will start with the distortion part first. Now, distortion sounds like exactly what it is. You distort, you change the situation from what it is to what you perceive it as based on the filters that you've applied. Again, this all goes back to your map, that schema, that cognitive mental representation that you have, all which is comprised of your values, your beliefs, your attitudes, other information that you have, your experiences, your emotional state, your physical state. All of these things play into the kind of map that you have and how you will distort the situation, the information coming in. Now, in a sort of sad way, people don't really actually see the world as it is because they see it through their filters. That's why I said memory and all the other, attention, it's not a tape recorder. It's not as it is. It's how you perceive it to be. So the problem here is that people have a limited capacity to process the sensory input. Again, because you can only take in so much information at one time, you can only remember so much of it, and we distort it through our filters. So these distortions, they cause confusion because on the one hand, you're either unable to comprehend the information, or the information that's distorted doesn't resemble real world settings, and that also causes confusion because you sort of expect something to be a certain way and it isn't, and you wonder why it isn't. It's not necessarily that the event is wrong, it's you may be interpreting it in a poor way. And the problems that this causes is that you have an inappropriate now reaction, and you make mistakes, or you misinterpret situations because you have a lack of familiarity with the stimuli or whatever event that's happening. Maybe you just, as I said, misinterpreted what was going on, and you've built a poor foundation, and you're further filtering that. So we don't actually experience things as they are. We almost experience them as we think they are. When I was a child, I used to watch this show called Art Attack. I don't know if any of you've seen it, but he was in one of the shows, he was teaching us how to draw a teacup. And he said, just make yourself a cup of tea and draw that cup. And he said this, and I think it really applies to what I'm talking about now. Draw what you see, not what you think you see. Don't draw what you imagine a teacup to be. Just look at the cup and draw it as it is. So that's what we're doing when we're distorting things. see things the way that they are, not how you think that they are. So these distortions can really have a negative impact on how we interpret information and how we react to that information. So the next type of filter that we apply is to delete. Now this one's pretty straightforward. You either fail to notice certain things, and they may be relevant or maybe irrelevant, but you just didn't notice them, or you actively deleted them from your kind of repertoire, from your map. So, we call this synaptic pruning. You like how you prune a hedge or a tree, you cut back that which is not useful. Maybe you don't need to remember your fifth grade best friend's phone number, but you do need to remember other things. So you've only got so much storage space in your brain, and you want to keep the information relevant. Sometimes we remember really irrelevant things, and it's almost impossible to forget them. Anyway, don't ask me how that works. The brain is a mysterious thing, and the mind even more mysterious. So ultimately, you either fail to notice something that's relevant or maybe irrelevant, but nevertheless is not noticed. And you're constantly deleting things that are not useful anymore, or maybe they're traumatic, or whatever the reason may be. So deleting is a fairly straightforward concept. Now, generalization, that's another interesting filter that we apply. So when we generalize something, what we're doing is we're relying on patterns, or what's referred to as heuristics. Now, these can be quite simple or they can be complex. Basically, you don't want to relearn everything. When you learn how to drive, you don't need to relearn how to drive when you have a different car. You just remember what the pattern and procedures were. You remember the ideas. You remember certain objects. Every time you see a different looking chair, you don't have to relearn that it's something you sit in. So generalizations are very helpful. And the thing about generalizations is that they can be really helpful or they can be a hindrance. Now, more often than not, they're helpful, but when they're a hindrance is in certain applications when they're poorly applied. So they can actually be dangerous and not at all useful. So one of the few things that happens is, for example, all or nothing thinking. So you're generalizing. You had a bad boyfriend, all men are bad. You had a bad girlfriend, all women are bad. You, like I said, all or nothing. It's all good or all bad. In psychoanalysis, we call this splitting. And of course, it's not good. It's dichotomous thinking. You want to, accept the nuance, the ambivalence of a situation or an object or a person, whatever the case may be. We also overgeneralize, right? We apply one rule to a particular event to all events. So that's a fallacy, fallacious thinking, right? It's a fallacy of composition. You attribute the characteristics of a part to the whole or of the whole to the part. Both are not correct. Another one, we just jump to false conclusions because, again, we've generalized something that may not apply in that situation. So ultimately, the combination of these three principles, it really suggests that we do, in fact, live in a sort of perpetual hallucination. We're constantly projecting personal themes and our own life experiences and beliefs onto reality rather than actually experiencing reality as it is. And these projections oftentimes say much more about you than they do about the events themselves, because you're the one that's filling in the blanks, you're the one that's interpreting them in that way. So the data itself is ultimately meaningless unless you apply a certain filter to it. And I don't want to make a value judgment here about good or bad filters, but there are certain filters that are more helpful than others. And so that is why NLP is a good tool, because it's relying on a model, on a formula or an algorithm, if you will, to compare the information against a template. So the template is the kind of map that you construct. So for example, in a certain formula or algorithm or model, the same set of data with two different formats would completely classify the same event or person or whatever from one thing to another, and they could be totally opposite just based on those filters. So we see this all the time, right? Someone gets banned from something for doing X, and someone else doesn't get banned doing the same thing, but that's because all the data they've collected on that person fits a certain model, whereas that other person, the data fits a different type of model, and one is favored over the other. We do this as well when we apply our filters to other people, to events, to certain objects, to certain ideas. And that's why some people, for example, love Trump or hate him, because they have a certain filter and that's what they're applying. They're using certain patterns. The very interesting thing about these distortions, deletions, generalizations, they kind of filter a sort of catalog of information that you have. Now, the reason people react differently to certain things is, again, their experiences, their beliefs, and attitudes. For example, and let's just stick to Trump because he's a very easy person to contest. Someone may have had a bad experience with someone with his type of hair. And you've overgeneralized that pattern of people with this kind of hair are bad. Maybe the way he talks, the sound of him, the tan that he has, or whatever. Maybe it has actually nothing to do with him at all, but the way people react to him, it, and I don't mean to use this word in a trivial way because it actually does have a very scientific application. It triggers people. And I said this before in my Antifa video. We joke about, oh, you're triggered, triggering the libs and all this. It's not really a joke because people have actually experienced certain types of traumas, whether real or imagined, but nevertheless, they affect you all the same. And that's why I said that trigger button in the previous slide. These are emotional buttons. They are, in fact, triggers. So there is something about certain people or experiences that do have a very visceral reaction. And it's due to a combination of these filters that we are using. Okay, so you really, if you want to understand a person, you really do need to understand the whole procedure and process and how they think the way that they do and how they arrive at certain conclusions, because it's not a linear thing. If you remember that picture of that map before, it all branches out in different directions, and it's not that easy, and that's why therapy takes quite a lot of time. You really do need to understand the depths of how and why people behave the way that they do. It's very complicated. Now, another facet for determining or predicting behavior and in turn modifying it is personality. Now, the topic of personality is itself a whole field of study, and I am quite familiar with it. So, if you would like me to make another video on this topic, I would. But just to simplify it a little bit, how does personality affect the way you react? Well, personality determines how you will distort, delete, and generalize and ascribe meaning to information and events and in turn to people. So you have a certain catalog of, or a library of values and traits. So some people are very security driven. Is something safe or not safe? Some people are very freedom oriented. Do they gain or lose freedom by certain actions? Some are very much driven by belonging. They need to feel accepted or if they feel rejected. Some are very competence based, whether they're smart or not smart, whether there's merit to what they're doing or not. And others are more expression oriented, if they feel special or not special. This is not an exhaustive list. There's, of course, more types of personality traits that come out. But ultimately, there are going to be different ways that people react, and you may have different combinations of these. Now, a lot of times the things that we disagree about is, for example, this left-right thing. One wants freedom and the other wants security. Okay, but do people want those exclusively? Probably not. People maybe want the freedom to be unsafe, right? You also maybe want to some people want to maybe curtail some freedoms for safety. I think it was Churchill who said those who sacrifice freedom for security will get neither and will deserve to lose both. Something like that. Very deep and insightful, and I'm sure I've misphrased it, but the gist of it is the same. So how you value and frame things is one facet, but the other facet is your personality and what your natural temperament is like and what your instincts lead you towards. So if you're in a situation and you are in an argument, and you may well be right in that argument, someone is wrong, but you don't want to risk being rejected, so you're a belonging or excuse me, a belonging oriented person, then you will maybe retreat even though you were right, because you've made a hierarchy of what is more important, and you find belonging to be more important than, for example, the competence thing or being right or expressing yourself. So it's all based on certain people's values. So, how do we actually reprogram people? Well, here's a quick little representation. But how NLP ultimately works is by going in reverse. So, you find out where people are at now, what has caused them to be that way, and where it has led them, how they now cope with these events, and just to work backwards, to reframe, reprogram ultimately them. Ultimately, it's a whole combination of things. So consider reality and your experiences to be like a radio station. Multiple frequencies are playing at once, but you can only tune into one of them at a time. Now, you may try to tune into more than one at a time, but then you have an issue with attention and memory and overloading yourself with stimuli. You'll be crossing signals, and it will further confuse you. So, what people are only able really to tune into one frequency at a time. You can only listen to one radio station at a time, right? Now, basically, once you are tuned into that station and you're taking all this input, how you filter everything is going to affect how you behave and how you react. So all actions are based on your interpretations, and they have to be either in accord with your map, or if they go against your map, which is your cognitive schema for something in your mental library, your experiences either agree or disagree with the agenda that we have, our own expectations. We have our own narratives that we would like to fulfill. Now, there is a bidirectional relationship between your physiological responses and your psychological responses. And again, it is dependent on the information, the map, your expectations, and the sensory input that you get. So everything is constantly being compared against our template of our agenda, our expectations, our narrative, right? And so what happens is oftentimes, as due to those distortions, generalizations, and deletions, we build a lot of bad habits because we form associations with certain events and certain people and certain experiences, and we build these associations through our physical experiences, but also the manufactured narratives that we're constantly generating during those experiences. So how does this Pavlovian sort of a conditioning happen? Some event happens, someone says something happens in the environment around you, you have a little narrative, a script going in your head, and you've put those two things together, and that is now the association that you've built with it. So ultimately, you have to now reprogram and retrain yourself to change that, because the more that you have that script running in your head and the more certain experiences happen, you further condition and reinforce that reaction. So what you need to do is, of course, to do the opposite. And that's why NLP is really effective. So basically, your past experiences are a future trigger for you, and this is what is meant by response expectancy. For example, you're driving to work and you're driving over a bridge and you're really afraid that you're going to crash on this bridge. So every time you're on the bridge, your hands start sweating. And then now they start sweating when you're approaching the bridge because you're expecting that response, right? Past experiences become your future triggers. So, how do you break out of this? Well, you have to burst your own bubble, so to speak. You cannot break the programming without breaking the narrative and agenda. And that is where NLP sort of starts. So, everything I've said up until now is setting the stage for NLP. People are ultimately trapped in their own minds, quite literally. We have a narrative, we have an agenda, we have expectations, we've got our maps, we've got our experiences, we've got everything that is accumulated in our lives used as a filter. So we never really actually experience the world as it is. And therefore, the only way to snap out of it, we've called it red pilling or, whatever the case may be, but you really do need to take it seriously. As funny as it is, in one application, people are truly struggling with this and they're unable to live a fulfilling life. And it's all because, and I'm not trying to be harsh, some things are of no fault of your own. You can be a genuine victim, but oftentimes we sort of do this to ourselves because we're so unwilling to either admit when we were wrong or to see things in a different way. And so the problem really lies with yourself. But here's the good news. If it lies with yourself, the problem, then the solution also lies with yourself. I think it was Freud who said something like, people are both the causes and solution to their own problem. There's really no better way of summing that up than that. So I'll leave on this one point. And it's a nice little example and illustration of what I was talking about before when I said it takes certain skills, for example, to have a negative experience. The same skills are required to have a positive experience. So let's consider the wonderful joy of falling in love. It requires the same process and the same skills to fall in love as it does to fall out of love. You are taking in a certain amount of information, only certain information, at the exclusion of all other information. So when you meet the person that you're falling in love with, oh, they're so great, they do this and they do that, and they're just so wonderful, and you ignore everything else about them that may not be so wonderful. That's how you fall in love. Now, how do you fall out of love? Oh, they do this, I can't stand it, and they do that, and you forget all of the wonderful things that you did love about them. Just like you ignore all the things that maybe annoy you about them because you're in love, you forget all the things you loved about them when you are annoyed and out of love. So just keep that in mind. The same thing that can be your problem can be reframed to be the solution. So that is why NLP is a really, really good tool. In the next presentation, we're going to go over some of those techniques and see how they're applied and see if maybe you can find some utility in them as well. So I hope you found this video helpful. I know it was a little bit long, but it's an in-depth topic and I really am only just scratching the surface of it because I do think it's important that we try to understand something before we dive right into it. Again, it's all complicated. It's not very black and white. It's not good or bad necessarily. It's how you use it, right? You just have to be willing to see that there are many, many reasons why people do what they do. And the only way to sort of get through to people isn't by beating them over the head with a club and saying, why don't you understand this? You're so obviously wrong. That's you're not going to persuade anyone that way. But you are going to persuade them by, again, you may think that this is manipulative, but we do this all the time. You have to sort of reprogram someone. You have to retrain them. And it's not just through talking. Talking is one thing, but you have to change the actions, change the beliefs. You have to work beneath the surface of the iceberg for it to manifest at the tip of the iceberg. So I'll leave it at that. As I said, I hope you found this interesting. I will certainly be making another video about this as part 2, possibly part 3. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you guys very soon.